President Trump said to them, help is on the way, and help didn't come. And they were mowed down in the streets. And this brutal and barbaric regime is still in power. And I would like to see nothing more than to see the regime go. The question for me, are American bombs and American missiles sufficient to generate a regime change that would actually lead to the freedom and dignity of the Iranian people? And I've not heard anybody with a straight face say, yeah, we can make that happen.
I think Iran should know that if they will attack Israel because the Americans have struck them, and regardless of the reason and the timing, Israel will respond in a way that could damage their economy and their regime. And they say that because I think that Iran should be worried to drag Israel back in. And if I were Iran, I wouldn't do it.
Welcome to the first episode of the 6th season of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm happy to go on this journey with you. We're joined today by two former national security advisors to discuss the current crisis between the U.S. and Iran. We have Jake Sullivan, who served in that role under President Biden. He oversaw the U.S. response to October 7th. Among the many things he does, he's also the co-host of his own podcast called The Long Game. And we have Eyal Hulata, who was the Israeli national security advisor under Prime Ministers Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. Today, tensions between the United States and Iran are very high. Protests broke out across Iran last month, which were followed by a brutal crackdown by the Iranian regime. President Trump famously promised the protesters,
all Iranian patriots, keep protesting. Help is on its way.
Ayatollah Khamenei has said if the U.S. attacks, Iran will lash out in the region, and has also singled out Israel. Both parties have engaged in negotiations in the past few weeks to try to come up with a diplomatic solution, yet the gaps seem very wide. At the same time, the U.S. military has built up its presence in the region.
The U.S. sending another carrier strike group to the region as Iran is closing the Strait of Hormuz, a vital shipping lane.
This is considered the biggest U.S. buildup in the Middle East since the U.S. war with Iraq in 2003. As negotiations between the U.S. and Iran stall, is a return to conflict inevitable? Will Israel join in? What are the objectives, and what can be achieved? Here today, we will unpack these critical questions with Jake and Eyal. Well, it's wonderful to be with both of you. Tensions over Iran are really sky high right now. Huge U.S. military footprint in the region. Both of you have wrestled with whether a negotiated solution to Iran's nuclear ambitions is even possible. And I really just want to find out from both of you, if you were advising President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, how would you weigh, given diplomacy versus the risk of a military campaign? What would you say to your principal? Jake, maybe we'll start with you.
So in this scenario, I'm advising Donald Trump. Okay, I got it. That's going to take a little work to get into that headspace. Not my usual daily existence, but fair question. Look, I would start with the question, what are we trying to achieve? Because I think getting clarity around that then leads you down the right path between force and diplomacy. And it seems to me, number one, we have to put Iran's nuclear program in a box for the long term. Number two, we have to continue to deter Iran from being a regional aggressor. And then number three, we need to support the Iranian people. And the question for me is, will military force really achieve those three goals, or is it just going to set us up for more military force 8 months from now, a year from now? Donald Trump said he had totally obliterated the nuclear program last summer. Now it's February, just 8 months later, and we're talking about bombing the nuclear program again, suggesting it wasn't totally obliterated and that you're going to have to continue to take military action. The Israeli government and the American government said that they had just dramatically degraded Iran's missile program. Now, 8 months later, that missile program's a threat, so it has to be dealt with again. And then Donald Trump said he was going to come in and use force to support the protesters, but the Iranian government did this industrial scale crackdown on the protesters, killing thousands of them, maybe even tens of thousands, depending on which count you look at. And now the protests have essentially subsided, and the question is, would military force do much to support those people at this time? So I would be inclined to tell him, Iran's weak. Iran is under threat, military threat. And Iran is putting things on the table, including, it appears, suspension of enrichment for some period of time, including potentially shipping enrichment out. And I would try to take a deal while at the same time making sure I had all of the deterrent capabilities in place to be able to ensure that Iran could not effectively threaten the United States or its allies or partners in the region. I think military force at this point does not have a clear rationale or objective, and is likely, in my view, either to lead to some kind of unintended, extended back and forth and conflict, or maybe it wraps up fast, but then we're just going to be right back at military force 6, 8, 10 months from now, again, just as we were 8 months ago. So that's what I would say to the president at this point. I might actually also add that he has no congressional authority to just up and start bombing Iran when there is not an imminent threat from Iran at the moment facing the United States of America or our interests, and that he should go to Congress and actually explain what he intends to do. He could do that in a classified session if he wants to, and get their support before he proceeds further down the track of military action.
So before I get to you, Eyal, I just want to be clear. Jake, what would you thus say to the people of Iran who, you said help is on the way, Mr. President? Is there a value to degrading the regime and hoping that the Iranian people can take it from there, hitting some of the key apparatuses of repression like the Revolutionary Guard, the Basij? Would this be a message to the people of Iran? Is U.S. credibility on the line in this regard, given the president's promises?
To a certain extent, I have to acknowledge that U.S. credibility is on the line because Donald Trump went out on Truth Social and threatened the Iranian regime, said, if you kill protesters, we are going to use force against you. In fact, I think he used the phrase locked and loaded. And then as the protesters went bravely out into the streets to demand their rights, their dignity, their freedom from this barbaric regime, President Trump said to them, as you just referred to in your question, help is on the way. And help didn't come. And they were mowed down in the streets, massacred in the streets. And so many of them lost their lives. And this regime, this brutal and barbaric regime, is still in power. And I would like to see nothing more than to see the regime go. And I think the Iranian people deserve a day of freedom and dignity. The question for me, are American bombs and American missiles fired from the skies and from offshore sufficient to generate a regime change that would actually lead to the freedom and dignity of the Iranian people? And I've not heard anybody with a straight face say, yeah, we can make that happen. Now, your question presupposes, let's give it a shot and just see what happens. Maybe good things will happen. I think it is a very dangerous game to play to embark on a military campaign, a war against another country, by just dropping bombs and hoping good things happen. I think you need more clarity on what you are going to achieve through the strikes. Now, some might say, well, let's just take some symbolic strikes to impose costs to show the regime that you can't do this cost-free. I don't think, and I understand, I actually really get the emotional pull of that argument, that it would be good to hit the Basij and the IRGC. I get that. I even feel it. But I think we have to be logical and strategic about the use of military force and doing things just to send a message, to make ourselves feel like we did something because of our Truth Social post. That's not good enough. That does not, in the end, I think, survive the strict scrutiny we should be applying to the application of American military force abroad. And so count me as a deep skeptic that we should proceed for that purpose. And I would just reinforce that if our stated purpose is just to degrade the regime, that is not a purpose of imminent self-defense of the United States. And therefore, if President Trump wants to do that, he should go to Congress and get authorization to do that.
Eyal, over to you. You're briefing Prime Minister Netanyahu, and while you work for Prime Minister Bennett and Lapid, there was some overlap, I believe, with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So you're briefing him. How do you think you would urge him to weigh these? What are the objectives here? What is attainable as you see it?
First, I also need to tune my mindset into this. I don't know what's easier for Jake
Exactly.
to advise President Trump but it is true. I was National Security Advisor to Netanyahu for 10 days at the beginning of January. The first advice I would give Netanyahu is that this really isn't our game to play at the moment. I think the last thing that is reasonable for Israel at this point is to be in a position where it can be perceived as either dragging or encouraging the United States of America to take military action at all, specifically on Iran. This is just not, I think, the right thing to do in general, by way of substance, not only by way of the politics of it. Israel acted in June of last year against the Iranian nuclear program. That was a legitimate, justified, and also a successful campaign that, we took upon ourselves to start and took the consequences associated with it. The United States of America was very much involved both in helping us defend against this strike, in fact, other countries in the region as well. And the decision by President Trump to join the strike for Midnight Hammer was also significant in the outcome of it. I know what we did then. I know why we did it back then. And if I was National Security Advisor, I would actually advise, I think, any prime minister sitting in that chair at that point in time to go at it. Maybe we didn't obliterate the Iranian nuclear program back then, but there is no enrichment in Iran for the last 8 months. In fact, this is the first time since the end of the Paris Accord back in 2006, almost 20 years ago, that there is no enrichment in Iran, not a single centrifuge. As far as our intelligence, the U.S. intelligence, and other sources are aware, there is not a single centrifuge spinning in Iran. That's a huge accomplishment by way of degrading and even halting the Iranian nuclear program. I know what we did back then. At this point, I would definitely agree with Jake when you put out the 3 objective or possible objectives. We need to keep the eye on the ball. The most important thing is how to make sure that Iran can never get back to a path of a nuclear program. In my mind, and we can talk about this, since there is zero enrichment in Iran, it's a fair demand to continue that there will be zero enrichment in Iran, not just for a short period of time, but for an indefinite period of time. They don't have it now. They shouldn't get it by way of a deal. And that is the first priority. I think that is the ball. The Iranian coercion of the region with missiles and proxies and terror activity is, of course, important. Very important for Israel, but also for the other partners in the region. And then comes the support of the people of Iran. And I think the people of Iran need support. I think at this point we know that it has been a total massacre. The question is how many dozens of thousands of people were mowed, to use Jake's word, not only on the streets, but also in the hospitals afterwards. The fact that President Trump weighed in to support them I think, was an important message to the Iranian people. But now, President Trump is now in a position where he promised something, and the American credibility is on the line. This is not a reason for Israel to suggest an American action. This is something the American administration, the American president, the American establishment needs to square with itself and with the Iranian people. What happens when the United States of America gives such advice to the people of another country? What kind of obligation does that entail? But if I'm speaking just from my perspective, my advice to Prime Minister Netanyahu would be, this is not our game. We need to stick at it. We need to demand how the outcome of a deal should, and in fact, the Americans decided to engage with a diplomatic negotiation with the Iranians. What are the criteria of success to that? How we think that should end, and also to be as constructive as possible to that end. If that does not work out, it's at this point for the American president to decide how to respond, whether or not pressure is the right approach and to continue to push the Iranians because their situation is really very bad and they lack good options, I think, all around. Whether or not for the United States to use military action is something for the United States to decide.
Eyal, just to follow up on this, Prime Minister Netanyahu was here, he'd say, okay, what is the likelihood that diplomacy's criteria would be successfully met when it comes to ballistic missiles, for example, that showed a lot of lethality, a lot of accuracy, hitting the Soroka Hospital in Beersheba, the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot, the Kiryat, right next to the Kiryat, the Israel's Pentagon. You know, how the Iranians said, we're not even going to talk about ballistic missiles. How do you ensure that diplomacy deals with the issues that Israel certainly, and I'm asking you as an Israeli, sees as critical?
With this kind of complicated situations, I like to break things down into more simple cases. How would I have answered that question if there was no round of protests in Iran? President Trump would have promised to aid the Iranian people and build this beautiful armada, as he calls it. Israel needed to respond to such a threat, even without an American threat to retaliate against Iran. And to that, I would say, first, the most important thing is to make sure that Iran does not have nuclear capabilities. Of course, the missile capabilities are important. We've suffered from that round of attacks over the 12-day war. In fact, we did also back on April and October of 24, when Jake was still National Security Advisor, another rounds of heavy barrages of missiles, ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. And again, I think a wonderful collaboration between both our military establishments and intelligence establishments to defend. Israel needs to figure out what we do with the Iranian missile program, even if the United States does not go on a round of strike. Is it possible that Israel will need to act militarily on Iran sometime in the future because of that? Maybe. I'm not sure that this is the time to do this. I'm not sure that our defense establishment or defense capabilities are in the position that we need them. I'm not sure that the window of opportunity that is still open in Iran to operate militarily, I think it's pretty wide, and there would have been more time for it. So this is about Israel's military action. Do I think that there is a critical reason to go at it right now? No, I don't. I think that if there was no other circumstances, Israel would probably not go at it now, after the successful raid 8 months ago. As it goes to the negotiation, if it was up to me, I would encourage not to embark in negotiations right now, but to let Iran fry a little bit more. I think the Iranian hand is very weak. There's no urgency to start a negotiation right now. As I said, there is no enrichment at all in Iran, and their economic situation is worse than ever before. Their diplomatic situation, they're as isolated more than they've been before. They did not get the support, neither from the Chinese nor the Russians, as they wanted to. And I thought that even if you want to get into a negotiation and try to get the deal that I think we should get from them, and I said before, I think we are probably at the best opportunity ever to get a deal that will have completely zero enrichment indefinitely, because they don't have any enrichment. And this should be a basic principle that in a negotiation, Iran does not get something it doesn't have. It only gives things it has in exchange for economic relief and other issues. We need to take out the stockpiles of enriched uranium that was not damaged, but they should be granted the right to continue to enrich uranium, because they are not enriching uranium at the moment. So I would, if it was up to me to be in such a conversation, I would urge to make sure that we start, if the Americans go on a negotiation, to start in the best possible conditions, so that Iran will have to drink from the poisoned chalice and concede to the, I think, justified demands that we have on them. Is this the proper time for it? We'll need to wait and see. I'm not sure how the negotiations will play out. I do believe and understand that the American administration is holding the line on the demands. And I guess in a matter of days, I mean, I don't know when this podcast will be out. Maybe by the time this is aired,
Monday.
I think Monday is safe enough. Maybe the next Monday we'll already know how this ended.
Let me go to Jake, just before I get into what if war breaks out and think about that. But Jake, there's been 3 rounds between Israel and Iran since October 7th, April 2024, October 2024, and of course the 12 Days War. I'm trying to think of, and there's been a remarkable deepening of U.S.-Israel military cooperation, multinational air defense, integrated under CENTCOM and the like. But there were also a lot of assumptions about what was achievable with the use of military force against Iran and against proxies. I'm just wondering, since October 7th, since these 3 rounds, if you look at the set of assumptions, has that at all changed after these 3 rounds? And are there certain lessons to keep in mind, given now that we have 3 rounds of experience? Jake, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think first, going back multiple administrations, Bush, Obama, Trump 1, Biden, I think the expectation or the calculus of the risk of directly striking Iran, either by Israel or by the United States, that a higher risk premium was placed than actually bore out. But I don't think it's as simple as to say, oh, we just misjudged the risk, because a lot happened over the course of the year 2024. For one thing, month by month, and ultimately culminating in the taking out of Nasrallah, Hezbollah was essentially removed as a serious threat. And that was one of the most significant risk factors being weighed in a decision to strike Iran. So that risk factor got removed. Number 2, Iran's own capabilities, its air defense capabilities and its missile capabilities, I think Israel in particular, but the United States to a certain extent, was able to show both offensive and defensive capacity to neutralize that, or at least to render it far less effective than we might have thought otherwise. So by the time Donald Trump took office in January of 2025, Iran was weak. It didn't have Hezbollah as a cat's paw. It didn't have real meaningful air defenses. We had already shown twice that massive barrages of missiles from Iran could do a little bit of damage, but honestly not significant and certainly not strategic damage in Israel. And when you add all that up, it did create, I think, in 2025, a much greater degree of operational flexibility to take action. And I think we now have to recognize that the United States and Israel can hit Iran and can achieve operational objectives in doing so, like taking out Fordo or Natanz or the conversion facility at Esfahan. But, David, this is really important. How does that translate into securing the ultimate objectives? Have we fully and finally dealt with the nuclear program because we bombed the crap out of it last summer, Israel and the United States? No, it's still an issue. In fact, it is the subject of ongoing negotiations. And if we took further strikes against nuclear sites in Iran, would we likely be in a position to come back on this podcast and say, okay, now it's done. We're just done. It's over. No. Ultimately, that will have to be dealt with through negotiations one way or the other. And then to these other points, fundamentally, the question is, can you actually induce regime change through aerial bombardment campaigns against Iran? I'm not going to say there's a 0% chance of that. I don't know. Maybe. I think it's unlikely. And I don't think we have even the faintest idea what the answer is to the question, okay, even if you could do that, what comes next? And is that ultimately going to serve the Iranian people? Now, some people would say anything's better, anything's better. I don't think that's a sufficiently compelling answer to the question, what comes next, when you're talking about launching a war. Final point, Iran has shown, going back to the Soleimani strike and then the 12-day war, that they would prefer de-escalation to escalation, particularly when it comes to the United States. When it comes to Israel, they're prepared to fire as many ballistic missiles as they can get launched, and Israel was very effective in the 12-day war at reducing the overall size of those salvos so that they could more easily deal with them alongside the United States and other partners through air defense. But Iran is not deterred as a matter of will from trying to strike Israel. It is more deterred from unleashing a barrage against an American base or American facility in the region. In the Soleimani strike, they did a single volley against Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, no U.S. fatalities. In the 12-day war, they did a single strike against Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, no U.S. fatalities, and then they let it go. Can we be confident that if the U.S. hits them now, they will not actually retaliate in a more significant way against the U.S. or against other countries in the region? I think people can calculate that the odds of that are lower than they might have said 2 years ago, but can we say that that is not a serious risk that has to be factored in by the President of the United States on behalf of the American people? No, it is a serious risk, and it has to be factored in. And it's a risk-benefit analysis. And if there is a risk that there is escalation, that Iran does actually retaliate this time to a greater extent than it did before against U.S. interest in the region, you really got to sell the benefit. And I think the argument that, well, Trump put up some Truth Social posts, the protests got crushed, but now he's just got to do something for the sake of it, that is not, in my view, a serious basis upon which to proceed with military action against Iran. And I think Eyal's points on the nuclear missile program are right. I would also add one other thing, which is I think what Eyal was saying about not having to rush into any kind of deal right now is, I hadn't quite thought of it in those terms. Fair enough. I'm not saying the U.S. has to cut a deal immediately. Fine. Have negotiations. Hold as firm a line as you want. Play it out, because Iran is weak. The U.S. does have the capacity to continue to bring a range of pressure. And what's odd to me is this whole question of military action right now seems to have been sparked by these Truth Social posts. It's now been converted over to the nuclear and missile issues. And I'm sorry, but I think those posts ended up putting the U.S. in an awkward position without the president having thought it through. And I just don't think it's right for us to say, well, we got no choice, we just got to go start bombing. I think that does not make sense to me from the perspective of the U.S. national security interest.
Yeah, let me go to you. Let's say war does break out here and there are these strikes, and I'm just trying to think that everything we've learned in these 3 rounds with Iran and Israel, the abilities, the limitations of Iranian offense, their lack of air defense, the escalation options, what concerns you the most if war is a given? What keeps you up at night, as sometimes people ask?
I've been up most nights since October 7 anyway. There are many things on my mind as it comes to that. If I may, before I answer what are the things that I'm worried about, I want to provide something that I think should be something that the Iranians are worried about. Because for years, it was a conventional thinking that Iran thought that Israel will have the will to attack Iran, but won't have the capability. Whereas the United States of America has the capability to attack Iran, but will not have the will. And I think that what Iran has learned, definitely through the 12-day war, is that both these premises are false. Israel showed that it can, and the United States showed that it would, given the circumstances that developed then. And the reason I say that is because I think Iran should know at this point that maybe short of Fordo, that the MOPs by the B-2s took care of it back in June.
The MLPs, just for our listeners, is the massive ordnance penetrators.
Also known as the mother of all bombs, which only the United States has. I remember the first time I was shown a video of it back in 2012. That was very impressive back then and definitely worked exactly as planned. Short of the Fordo facility, Iran should know, given what they've learned from what Israel was able to do, that there isn't a single target in Iran that we can't hit, because the targets that are still there, being military targets, definitely economic targets, any other targets, are actually easier to penetrate than the Natanz facility and the Fordo facility. And of course, there might be some that aren't, but there is enough damage that they should understand that Israel can put there. I think when Israel is telling the Iranians that we do not want to be dragged into this round of conflict, but should Iran decide to attack Israel in retaliation, to Jake's point, yeah, they might be easier for them, or they might feel that it's better for them to retaliate on Israel than the United States. I think that the outcome of the Israeli response to it will be more devastating than what they will get from the United States, just because in such conditions, I think Israel will be freed to attack targets almost at will. This wouldn't be something that we've started. If Iran decides to unilaterally attack our centers of civilian population the way they did in the 12-day war, in fact, also the way they tried to do back in April and October, back then, the message was a message of restraint. And I think Israel showed a lot of restraint back in April. We've shown less restraint in October, and we targeted their missile defense and, in fact, laid the ground to a very successful raid in the 12-day war. But also in the 12-day war, we focused on their nuclear facilities, on their missile facilities. Israel decided, and rightly so in my mind, to refrain from attacking infrastructure in Iran. We did not attack any of the economic. We just signaled something so the Iranians will understand that we could, in case they thought that we forgot where their facilities were. But we didn't go after all of this. And I think Iran should know that if they will attack Israel because the Americans have struck them, and regardless of the reason and the timing, Israel will respond in a way that could really damage their economy and their governance of their regime. And I say that before I answer what worries me, because I think that Iran should be worried to drag Israel back in. And if I were Iran, I wouldn't do it. Maybe if I were Iran, I wouldn't attack American bases or American ships or any other assets. And I surely hope that, like in the 12-day war, they do not retaliate against the Saudis or the Emiratis. They refrained from doing it back then, and I think for a good reason. And I hope they don't make such a mistake in the future. So this is why I think Iran should be worried. Now, again, for us, two things worry me. One is that the learning curve that we had from the 12-day war, which is substantial and significant, there is also a learning curve that the Iranians have. Did the Iranians learn how to overcome our defense mechanisms in a way that will cause more civilian damage? Of course, I'm worried about it. I think we're doing a good job to prevent it. You don't know until things actually happen. Is Hezbollah now going to join, and in a way they didn't during the 12-day war? I think they won't, but maybe they will. To suffer all of this attack while we're attacking their nuclear capabilities is something that I can absorb and understand by way of level. I wouldn't want to pay such a price for no reason. So if the United States decides to attack Iran, I hope there is a good outcome coming out of it, because Israel might pay a price, and there could be an escalation that would lead to circumstances that no one wants. And that worries me, that this will be uncontrolled. The second thing that worries me, and unfortunately I say this because I think we have issues with the Israeli politics, but we also have issues with the American politics. What worries me is that even while Israel is not the cause of this attack, as Jake says, this might be an outcome of true social tweets or decisions made by the American administration, and rightly so. Israel will be blamed, like we have unfortunately been in the past, that this is our doing, that this was our pushing, that we actually made President Trump do this. This will have strategic consequences on the Israeli-American relationship into the future. That worries me not less than the damage, the physical damage that Israel will need to endure given such an attack. I don't want that to happen. If the United States decides to attack Iran for whatever reason, this should be an American decision made by following American interest, following American logic. And if Israel needs to pay some kind of conditionality or we're dragged into it, okay, so be it. We can take it. We've taken it before, we'll take it again. And I'm worried that this will happen, either because of extremists on the MAGA side or because of people on the Democratic side that will say, no, actually, we know what happened here. It's Israel who dragged the United States into this. This isn't true. And I want to say this because I think it's very important that we all, not only the like-minded, but the clear-headed and the cool-headed for sure, understand this to be true. If the United States decide to attack, Israel will deal with the consequences.
Jake, over to you. Just in the region, we've seen a reordering across the Middle East. We've seen Turkey and Qatar more as influential players in multiple conflicts, perhaps at odds with other Arab states in a way that hasn't been as pronounced as the past. A growing rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. There's new governments in Syria. There's new governments in Lebanon. Changes on the ground in Yemen and deeper Gulf involvement in Sudan and across the Horn of Africa. Some would just say these shifts and alignments are the messy aftermath of Iran's retreat, the weakening of the Ring of Fire of Qasem Soleimani after October the 7th. What should U.S. policymakers be thinking about this moment of regional shift? What are the opportunities? What are the risks? And it's fair to ask, if a conflict emerges with Iran, and if it goes well, if Iran is weakened, but just even if there isn't conflict, just a lot of shifts are going on in the Middle East. Jake, how would you see it?
Be brief because I'm really interested in hearing Eyal's take on this. First question for me is, how does the dynamic between Turkey and Israel evolve? There are more voices in Israel basically saying Turkey could become the new Iran. I'm open to hearing those arguments. I'm not necessarily persuaded by that at this point, but curious the Israeli perspective on the threat or the challenge posed by Turkey, because I think that is going to be a big factor in the period ahead. And of course, Turkey has something to say about that, how they proceed and what choices they make. I think that the most dramatic development outside of the context of Iran in the Middle East in recent weeks has been this deterioration in relations between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And it doesn't seem like a temporary hiccup. It seems like something deeper and more structural, that there's a personal element to it, that there's an economic competition element to it, that there's a kind of regional competition element to it. And of course,
you've written about, if I recall, about the AI and how that they're competing over data centers and being a regional hub.
Both countries have a similar theory of where they want to take their future, and it's technology and clean energy and financial investment to move to a post-oil future down the road. The problem is they see it to a certain extent in zero-sum terms, that one will, to the extent one is getting ahead, it is partly at the expense of the other. This is a structural challenge that is not going to go away anytime soon. And then Israel has been pulled into this in a way because, of course, the Abraham Accords between the UAE and Israel, and there are voices in Saudi Arabia essentially using that as a cudgel to say the UAE somehow is turning its back on other players in the region by having too close a relationship with Israel. This is not, I think, a positive development. So I think we should watch that closely. I don't think it gets enough attention in the United States. These are two partners, longstanding partners of the U.S., who are now very much at odds with one another. And I think we have to sift through both what the prospects of that are in the coming months and years and what the implications of it are for U.S. national security interests. And then I do think that one aspect of the Israeli strike on Qatar is it did make other countries in the region, including the UAE and Saudi, say, whoa, the regional landscape has really shifted here in a way. And Iran's power is way down. Israel's military power projection capabilities have been demonstrated amply. And I think this is now in the back of the minds of regional players about how to think about balance of power in the Middle East as Israel gains in capacity over time. And that's also a dynamic that we should watch as we go forward.
Thank you, Jake. Over to you, Eyal. How do you see all these, the fluidity in the region, and how should we be thinking about this? And how would a conflict with Iran influence your thinking, depending how it goes? But just a lot of change in the Middle East since October the 7th.
Yeah, a lot of change, and we have an opportunity to have an optimistic part in this podcast because so far it has been a bit gloomy. A lot of this change is actually positive. The fact that the Shiite axis or crescent, as we used to call it, has been weakened. Hezbollah is weakened. The Assad regime has fallen, maybe not directly because of Israel's gains over Hezbollah, but definitely indirectly that had a significant influence into this. These are good things. When the joint enemies of the programmatic countries in the region, the Abrahamic Alliance, and I will count the Saudis in this and get to the rift between the Saudi Arabia and the UAE in a minute. The fact that the joint threats, the Iranian axis, the Muslim brotherhoods have been degraded during this time is a good thing. I think it's a good thing for the region in this regard. And these are the kind of messaging I also get when I speak to people in those countries. They get it. They always prefer de-escalation. They always prefer not to engage in serious risks. In this case, it was Israel who did the action, and Israel also paid the direct and indirect price associated with it. And I think by and large, this is a good example of how things could play out in the future. Now, there was a question I asked prominent representatives in the region on this. Is it possible that they allow themselves, I talk about the Saudis and the Emiratis, to go into this conflict between them because the external threats have been diminished? It sounds like a privilege. And I say this with a smile because unfortunately I think that Israel thought, mistakenly so, that we have the privilege to get into things that we shouldn't have in the first half of 2000, first more than a half, 9 months, 10 months of 2023, thinking that we can indulge ourselves in things other than understanding what are the external threats to it. While the Saudis and the Emiratis quarrel over things that are very meaningful for them, for sure, I don't want to neither degrade or demean those. There are only 3 countries who are smiling at it. That's the Iranians, the Qataris, and the Turks. They enjoy this very much. All the rest do not. We do not. The Americans shouldn't. Neither of all the pragmatic other countries in the region. Their family, the connection between them is significant and important. This is not Saudi-Qatari rift or Emirati-Qatari rift. There are more ideological things between the Qataris and the rest of the GCC than between them. I hope actually that they can solve this. I hope that the United States can play a role into this. Maybe Israel can play a role into this. We definitely have an interest that this will calm down. The fact that they dragged us in, as Jake said, they used worse things than just saying that, Jake. There were some Saudi anti-Semitic remarks by officials that taken me aback for sure. But then not Crown Prince, of course, his brother, Khalid bin Salman, went to Washington and went out of his way to talk to every Jewish and non-Jewish representative there to try to ease and calm things down. I think that was very important on behalf of the Saudis because I think that there are terms and conditions to allow for Israeli-Saudi normalization. We were closer, Jake knows this better than me because it was in possession. I went to the outside, rather close before October 7. And I think that most of the conditions associated with that can be reproduced. And this is what I hope will be the outcome in the next following years as it comes to the Arab world, Sunni Arab world, pragmatic Arab world. Now, as it comes to Turkey, let me say that, first, Israel doesn't need more enemies. That's my strong belief. I played a role when I was National Security Advisor in trying to calm things down. We helped set the conditions and the opportunity for President Herzog to go visit President Erdogan back in 22. I had no illusions about maybe the Turkish intentions into this, but this played a de-escalating part in itself. I think Israel should continue to do so. I don't think I need to convince or not convince the Americans whether or not Turkey can be a new Iran. If Turkey will want to be a new Iran, if Turkey will decide that their territorial ambitions, their regional ambitions are high, and they want to take the opportunity that Iran is weak now to have dominance over the Middle East as if they're going back centuries, I think that's a risk for all of us. I think that's a risk for American interests. I think that's a risk for many other things. And that's just the point to mention. Turkey is a member of NATO. And I would want to at least think that there should be some constraints associated with being a member of NATO. So far, I think Turkey enjoys the benefits of being a member of NATO, and they practically can do whatever they want. And I hope and wish that there will be some constraining mechanism imposed on them as well. Because for us, this shouldn't emerge and become a strategic threat to Israel.
So I want to thank Jake Sullivan, Eyal Hulata, for a very wide-ranging, thought-provoking conversation about the crisis we're in and looking beyond it and the implications ahead. So I want to thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today on Decision Points.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for tuning in to this episode of Decision Points. If you liked it, please give us a 5-star review to help us build our community. And please be sure to subscribe and to continue listening throughout the season. There's a lot to unpack. I'm David Makovsky.